Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Anita had been far more generous toward Leslie than anyone realized, though Leslie herself remained oblivious to the extent of that generosity. From the outside, Leslie's sudden wealth looked like a miracle, an unexpected inheritance tied to her late mother, Barbara. To those in the community, it seemed as if Barbara had planned everything carefully, leaving her daughter well secured even in death. Yet the reality was more complicated, layered with hidden sacrifices, unspoken resentments, and financial maneuverings that would ultimately set Anita and Leslie on a collision course. Leslie flaunted her newfound fortune without hesitation, walking into rooms with the confidence of someone who believed she had finally surpassed the woman she considered both rival and obstacle. Her arrogance was fueled not just by the money but by her conviction that Barbara's passing was linked to Anita's neglect, or even worse, Anita's deliberate cruelty. That thought, repeated often enough in Leslie's mind, became the foundation of her pride, the justification for every sharp word she hurled toward Anita. Peaches, ever the wild card in these affairs, whispered suggestions that Anita's guilt was real, that perhaps Barbara's tragic decline had roots in neglect or betrayal. But whether Peaches spoke from sincerity or mischief was impossible to know. Leslie, desperate for validation, clung to those words as if they were gospel, refusing to consider the possibility that she might be misled. Her haste to claim victory blinded her to the nuances of the situation. She couldn't see that Anita had, in fact, been pouring her soul and her earnings into a trust that ultimately gave Leslie the illusion of independence. The irony was bitter. Anita had given Leslie everything she now claimed as her own. Yet Leslie turned that gift into a weapon, wielding it against the very person who had made it possible. Instead of humility, she chose hostility. Instead of gratitude, she chose provocation. She mistook Anita's quiet for weakness, imagining that her wealth gave her the leverage to crush a woman she had always envied. The cracks began to show early. Leslie, drunk on her sudden affluence, spent recklessly, seeking to establish her dominance in social and business circles. She arranged elaborate parties, flaunted designer wardrobes, and bought properties she had no real plans to manage. Her every move screamed not of stability but of desperation to be seen, to prove herself superior. She ignored the quiet warnings from advisors and friends who hinted that money without discipline was a trap. In her arrogance, she thought herself untouchable. Anita, however, was not idle. From her vantage point, she saw Leslie's posturing for what it was, the bravado of someone standing on a cliff without realizing how thin the ground beneath her feet had become. Anita knew the source of that money, and more importantly, she knew how quickly it could vanish. The trust was structured in ways Leslie had never cared to understand, its flow of funds dependent on Anita's continued consent. One decisive move, and Leslie's empire would collapse overnight. It wasn't just about finances, it was about respect. For Anita, the insult cut deeper than any accusation. Leslie wasn't merely questioning her character, she was rewriting the past, painting Barbara's demise as Anita's crime while basking in the wealth Anita herself had created. That was intolerable. Anita's silence had never meant surrender, and soon enough, Leslie would learn the cost of her recklessness. The tension reached its breaking point during a visit to the Dupree estate. The mansion still carried echoes of Barbara's presence, the carefully tended gardens, the grand yet faded portraits on the walls, the lingering scent of her favorite perfume in the sitting room. To Anita, those halls were heavy with memory, each corner whispering of the fragile bone she had once shared with Barbara. A bond now twisted by Leslie's accusations. Leslie arrived with all the entitlement of royalty returning to her throne. She praised Barbara lavishly, though her words were laced with venom, each compliment aimed like a dagger at Anita's heart. She accused Anita, not directly but through implication, of driving Barbara to despair. She invoked Articulette's forgotten tragedy as proof, forcing Anita to relive the painful chapter of someone who had slipped away into darkness, seemingly abandoned. The confrontation escalated. Anita, holding her composure with visible strain, eventually suggested that Leslie take her leave. It was a quiet dismissal, spoken with the authority of someone who had reached the end of her patience. But Leslie refused, her voice rising as she declared, I'm not so easily pushed aside as my mother was. Barbara was my mother." Those words, loud and final, shifted the air in the room. Anita stood frozen for a moment, the full weight of Leslie's declaration settling in. She had always suspected, but now the truth crystallized. Barbara's bloodline carried into Leslie. A revelation confirmed not long after by Anita's lawyer, who quietly validated Leslie's claim. The ground beneath Anita shifted, emotions colliding: shock, sorrow, anger, and a grim recognition of the ties that bound them more tightly than either had admitted. The revelation did not slow Leslie. Instead, it emboldened her. She paraded the idea that Barbara's fortune was hers by right, a birthright secured by blood and legacy. She waved the figure of her inheritance like a banner, daring Anita to object. "Why are you so upset?" she taunted. "This money isn't yours to keep. It was never about you." But then came Anita's revelation, delivered with calm precision. The funds Leslie bragged about were not from Barbara's savings or investments. They came from Anita herself, channeled into Barbara's accounts, sustained by years of performances and hard work. Every dollar Leslie flaunted carried the fingerprints of Anita's sacrifice. The smugness drained from Leslie's face for just a moment, replaced by stunned silence. Then came denial, a flurry of accusations that Anita was lying, manipulating, rewriting history. Yet the truth gnawed at her, undeniable in its logic. Barbara had left behind little, nearly nothing that could explain the magnitude of the fortune Leslie now enjoyed. The truth was too plain to ignore: she was living off Anita's labor, not Barbara's legacy. The clash of identities: daughter, rival, inheritor, betrayer intensified in ways that left both women scarred. For Anita, the choice became clear: she could no longer allow Leslie to weaponize what was never truly hers. Action was inevitable. With a single legal maneuver, she could freeze Leslie's access, cutting off the flow that sustained her extravagance. And she would do more than that. Anita resolved not just to block Leslie but to redirect the money towards something greater, a cause or foundation that honored Barbara's memory in a way Leslie never could. The prospect of watching Leslie crumble under the weight of her own arrogance was both justice and necessity. For too long, Anita had endured slights in silence. No more. As Anita prepared her countermove, the broader world spun with its own turbulence. In June's fractured household, echoes of abandonment and reconciliation played out with heartbreaking intensity. Martin and Smitty found joy in the shifting tides, their bond strengthened by the children's hesitant trust. June, meanwhile, was unraveling, her hope crushed when Samantha and Tyrell announced they no longer wished to see their biological mother. Her pain boiled into fury, and Naomi became the target. June's screams were raw, accusing Naomi of destroying her life, of planting dreams that could never bloom. She tore photographs, shredded reminders of what she had lost, until her tears blurred the wreckage in her hands. "I wish I had never seen their faces," she cried, her words echoing in the stillness like a curse. The children, though silent, heard everything. And even in their hurt, the love beneath June's anger reached them. When she later appeared at Martin and Smitty's home, her voice carried a mix of desperation and defiance. She shouted encouragement through the walls, certain Samantha was listening. She reminded her children of her love, of her determination to be someone they could one day embrace again. That moment marked a turning point. June did not reclaim her family that night, but she reclaimed herself. Choosing to leave with Naomi and Jacob, she accepted the uncertain path ahead. She asked for help, not in regaining her children but in rebuilding her life. Work, shelter, purpose, these would be her tools now. And in her heart, a vow burned bright: one day, her children would need her, and when that day came, she would be ready to stand as the mother they deserved. The parallel struggles of Anita, Leslie, and June formed a tapestry of pride, grief, resilience, and reckoning. Each woman carried the weight of choices past and present, their stories colliding and refracting off one another in ways none of them could fully predict. And while Anita's confrontation with Leslie edged toward a cataclysmic showdown, June's quiet resilience whispered of a different kind of strength, kind born not from wealth or power, but from survival and the refusal to give up. The storm was only beginning. and none of them could yet see how devastating the fallout would become. The aftermath of Anita's revelation struck Leslie harder than she would admit. On the surface, she doubled down on her arrogance, appearing in public with the same air of superiority, throwing lavish dinners and aligning herself with anyone who would listen to her exaggerated stories of triumph. But beneath the glitter, her certainty had begun to crack. The idea that Anita had financed her fortune haunted her. It made every purchase feel tainted, every word of praise from friends feel hollow. She began to hear whispers in her own head. Was she really powerful, or just a spoiled child living off another woman's sacrifice? Leslie's desperation to silence those doubts only accelerated her downfall. She began pressing Peaches for confirmation, demanding validation that Anita had wronged Barbara, that Barbara's death was the fault of betrayal rather than personal choice or despair. Yet Peaches, true to her mercurial nature, offered only ambiguity. One moment she comforted Leslie, suggesting Barbara had been abandoned. The next moment she hinted that the truth was murkier, that Barbara had made her own decisions, and Anita had been more involved in supporting her than anyone knew. This inconsistency left Leslie unstable, lashing out at friends, turning suspicion into fuel for reckless choices. Anita, meanwhile, carried out her plan with precision. Working quietly through legal channels, she froze Leslie's accounts, redirecting the flow of funds toward a foundation that bore Barbara's name. The foundation's mission was clear: to provide support for struggling performers and forgotten artists like Articulette, ensuring that their lives and legacies would not be erased by despair. It was both a tribute and a rebuke, a way of honoring Barbara and Articulette while simultaneously stripping Leslie of the wealth she had flaunted so carelessly. The shock when Leslie discovered her accounts had been drained was almost theatrical. She stormed into the Dupree estate once again, demanding answers, hurling accusations at Anita, who remained composed, calm in the face of Leslie's rage. The confrontation turned violent not in blows, but in words sharper than any blade. Leslie called Anita a thief, a manipulator, a destroyer of families. Anita responded with a quiet but devastating truth: the money was never yours to begin with. You mistook my generosity for weakness. That was your first mistake. The silence after those words hung like a curtain, suffocating and undeniable. Leslie had no counter-argument, no defense beyond the fragile shell of her pride. She walked out with her head high, but her eyes betrayed the tears she refused to shed. In the days that followed, her fall from grace was swift. Friends who had once basked in her wealth vanished when the money dried up. Business deals collapsed. Invitations stopped arriving. The lavish parties ceased, and the properties she had flaunted were repossessed one by one. Leslie, stripped of her illusions, began to feel the weight of isolation. Yet even then, she could not let go of her obsession with Anita. She convinced herself that revenge was still possible, that somehow she could turn the tide back in her favor. While Leslie spiraled, Anita turned her attention to Barbara's memory. She began curating old letters, journals, and photographs, piecing together a narrative of a woman misunderstood, overshadowed, and loved more deeply than Leslie would ever accept. The foundation events Anita hosted became both charitable efforts and public forums where Barbara's legacy was honored. People who had known Barbara stepped forward, sharing memories, complicating Leslie's narrative that Anita had driven her mother to despair. Slowly, a truer picture of Barbara emerged, done of complexity, tragedy, and love rather than the simple villainy Leslie had painted. Yet Anita was not immune to doubt. Late at night, when the house grew silent, she questioned whether her actions truly honored Barbara or whether they were fueled by her own anger toward Leslie. The truth was, Anita still carried guilt, not guilt for Barbara's death, but for the moments of distance, the times she hadn't been there, the words left unsaid. The line between justice and vengeance blurred, leaving Anita unsettled even in victory. Elsewhere, June's story deepened with quiet resilience. She had left Martin and Smitty's home with Naomi and Jacob, stepping into an uncertain world without the children she longed for. Yet for the first time, she embraced responsibility rather than fantasy. She found work, small, menial jobs at first, cleaning offices and sorting deliveries. She saved what little she could, holding on to the idea that every coin was a step toward stability. Naomi, despite the tension between them, became a steady companion, guiding June toward resources, shelters, and networks she would have never found alone. Her grief over Samantha and Tyrell lingered, gnawing at her in quiet moments. She replayed their faces in her mind, their voices, the way they had looked away when she reached out. But instead of breaking her, it became fuel. She vowed that if she could not be their mother now, she would become someone worthy of being their mother in the future. Every rejection became another brick in the foundation she was building for herself. Martin, watching from afar, found himself conflicted. He saw June's progress but remained wary, protective of the children who were slowly opening up to stability under his care. Smitty urged him to let go of bitterness, reminding him that June's effort was not for herself alone but for the kids. Martin's caution softened, though not entirely, and he began allowing small windows of connection, letters exchanged, updates passed through Naomi. The children resisted at first, but curiosity crept in. Samantha especially wrestled with the decision, torn between anger at June and a yearning for the bond only a mother could provide. Tyrell, more guarded, watched his sisters struggle with quiet concern. He remembered the pain, the instability, the broken promises, and he wasn't ready to risk reopening old wounds. Yet even he felt the pull of possibility when he overheard Martin and Smitty discussing June's progress. The idea that their mother was trying, truly trying, began to erode the fortress of resentment he had built around himself. Back in Anita's world, Leslie's desperation reached new extremes. Unable to regain her wealth, she turned to schemes and manipulation, attempting to rally sympathy by painting herself as the true victim of Anita's cruelty. She spread stories, half-truths twisted into accusations, seeking to reclaim the social ground she had lost. Some listened, but most saw through the charade. Still, her persistence made her dangerous, a cornered figure willing to lash out in unpredictable ways. Peaches reappeared at critical moments, feeding Leslie fragments of information, sometimes true, sometimes misleading. Whether she acted out of loyalty, malice, or amusement remained unclear. But her influence kept Leslie tethered to the hope of a comeback. "Anita isn't invincible," she whispered. "Everyone has a weakness. Find hers." Those words echoed in Leslie's mind long after Peaches left, becoming a mantra for her restless nights. Anita, sensing the storm was not yet over, fortified her defenses. She strengthened the foundation, made its funding impenetrable, and surrounded herself with advisors who could anticipate Leslie's next move. Yet she also knew that wealth and legality were not the only battlegrounds. The real war was over reputation, over memory, over truth itself. And in that war, perception could shift like quicksand. The climax loomed when Leslie discovered fragments of Barbara's journals, documents Anita had not yet shared publicly. Within them were passages that could be interpreted in many ways: moments of sorrow, references to feeling unseen, hints at a darkness Barbara had carried within herself. Leslie seized upon them, twisting the words into accusations that Anita had been the cause of Barbara's despair. She planned to release them publicly, to destroy Anita's credibility, to reclaim her own fractured narrative. But what Leslie failed to see was that the journals also contained love letters of gratitude to Anita, acknowledgments of the support she had given, confessions of her own failures as a mother to Leslie. To weaponize the journals would be to risk exposing not only Anita's vulnerability but also her own. At the same time, June's story intersected in subtle but meaningful ways. Through Naomi, she crossed paths with Anita's foundation. Initially as a recipient of small support, a temporary grant that helped her stabilize housing, June saw firsthand what Anita was building, how the foundation honored Barbara and others who had struggled. It inspired her, connected her own pain to a larger narrative of resilience. She began volunteering, pouring her energy into helping others, discovering strength she never knew she had. Samantha, hearing of her mother's involvement, grew conflicted once again. The idea that June was working with Anita, a figure tied to so much drama, made her wary. But it also stirred something else: hope. If Anita could forgive and rebuild, perhaps June could too. Tyrell, though reluctant, began attending foundation events with Martin and Smitty, finding himself unexpectedly moved by the stories of survival and second chances. The convergence of these lives set the stage for a reckoning larger than any single feud. Leslie, Anita, and June, each driven by pain, pride, and love, found themselves on paths destined to collide. The journals would surface, the accusations would fly, the truths would demand to be faced. And through it all, the question remained: who would rise stronger, who would fall, and who would finally learn that power was never in wealth or vengeance, but in the fragile, enduring act of forgiveness? The final act had yet to unfold, but the pieces were already in motion. The stage was set for an ending no one could control. Anita had the power of truth and the strength of her foundation behind her, but Leslie still held Barbara's journals like a ticking time bomb. Every page she read fed her determination, convincing her that if she released the words selectively, she could twist them into a dagger sharp enough to pierce Anita's reputation once and for all. Yet in her hunger for revenge, Leslie ignored the warnings in those same pages. Barbara's writings were not simple condemnations, they were layered, filled with regret and contradiction, a mirror of a woman who loved fiercely but carried wounds she never healed. One entry would blame Anita for her loneliness, another would thank her for years of loyalty, another would quietly confess that Leslie herself had been a source of pain. To publish them without care would risk exposing truths Leslie had no desire for the world to see. Anita, aware of Leslie's intentions, prepared not with lawyers or wealth but with vulnerability. She made the decision to share Barbara's words herself, releasing them to the Foundation's community in full transparency. Standing before an audience of donors, performers, and supporters, Anita read passages aloud, not the ones that painted her in glory, but the ones that revealed Barbara's struggles, her insecurities, her contradictions. Anita spoke of the complexity of grief, of love and guilt woven together, of how no single story could ever define a life. The honesty disarmed everyone, even those who had doubted her. It stripped Leslie of the power she thought she had, leaving her with fragments that no longer carried shock value. Worse still, it forced her to face the words Barbara had written about her own failures as a mother, words Leslie had hoped to keep hidden forever. The audience did not see Anita as a villain but as a woman brave enough to admit imperfection and grief. They saw Leslie as a shadow, clinging to bitterness in a battle already lost. The collapse was brutal. Leslie's last attempt at confrontation came in a crowded room, where she accused Anita of hypocrisy, shouting that all the generosity, all the foundations, were nothing but smoke and mirrors. But the more she raged, the more the crowd recoiled. Her desperation was naked, her arrogance stripped of its shine. In that moment, Leslie finally saw what she had become: alone, angry, and hollow. She left the room in silence, her footsteps echoing in defeat. Anita did not celebrate the victory. She sat alone afterward, holding Barbara's journal close, weeping for what had been lost and for the wounds that could never be undone. She had protected Barbara's legacy, but at the cost of shattering whatever fragile bond had existed between herself and Leslie. It was a victory without joy, a reminder that even the right choices can leave scars. Meanwhile, June's journey reached a quieter but equally powerful conclusion. Months of hard work and determination brought her to a point of stability she had never known. With Naomi and Jacob's help, she secured a small apartment and steady employment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She began to see herself not as a victim of circumstance but as a survivor carving her own path. The children remained cautious, but Samantha, unable to silence her heart, reached out first. A letter arrived one morning, simple and hesitant. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to talk." June cried when she read it, her tears soaking the paper, not out of sorrow but relief. Tyrell followed later, slower, guarded, but when he finally agreed to meet, June knew her patience had been worth it. She did not rush them, did not demand their love, but offered them the one thing she had never truly given before: consistency. Martin, watching from the sidelines, began to soften completely. He saw that June's effort was not an illusion this time. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe she could be part of their children's lives. Agonite as the unstable figure of the past, but as someone who had fought her way back to dignity. The final image was not one of grand spectacle but of quiet convergence. Anita, standing at a memorial event for Barbara, lit a candle and spoke of love's complications, of how forgiveness is not always given but must sometimes be chosen. June, in another corner of the city, hugged her children awkwardly yet sincerely, feeling the warmth of a bond she thought was gone forever. And Leslie, far from both of them, sat alone with Barbara's journals spread across a table, reading them not as weapons but as confessions from a mother she never fully understood. The story closed not with triumph, but with a fragile truth, that survival is never simple, that family wounds run deep, and that sometimes the hardest battles are not against others but within ourselves. Anita had her justice, June had her second chance, and Leslie Thawbrook was left with the possibility of change, should she ever choose to take it. The gates that once divided them were not destroyed, but they stood open just enough to hint at something greater beyond them, the chance, however faint, for redemption.